This is Breakthrough News, and you are watching The Freedom Side. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back alongside you.
It's always great to be back alongside you, Eugene.
Well, I appreciate that. And of course, big shout out to everyone who is joining us here. Happy to have you with us, and a good opportunity to remind you to go ahead and hit the subscribe button and then use that down arrow once you do that in order to turn on the alerts so that you can be alerted very easily, so you don't have to look far for all of the content coming out here from Breakthrough News, including dispatches with Rania Khalek. An increasing number of people have been telling me they have indeed been making sure notifications are on. So I appreciate the people watching regularly enough that they want to reassure me about that.
Well, I do appreciate that as well. And I also, of course, want to remind people to like, subscribe, and share this episode. It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. But most importantly, I want to also tell people that you can support independent media here at Breakthrough News by becoming a member. Go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, and you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch like that very cool mug you just saw Eugene drinking out of. I have mine right over here. Look at that, with a very cool straw. But most importantly, you'll be helping to support an independent media outlet that brings you what's actually happening in the world rather than the tsunami of nonsense that supports endless war everywhere, which continues to escalate. And I do, of course, want to say, Eugene, that obviously, as we all know, biggest news story in the world right now is that Charlie Kirk was assassinated yesterday. And as I already said on my social media, it's a horrible situation, but this is a weekly news show. We've already scheduled guests for today's episode to cover other urgent issues happening all around the world. So we'll be sticking with that focus. So with that, Eugene, I will turn to you for the excellent casts of guests we have to talk about. Just one bad situation after the
next. The hits keep on coming, as they say, and we're going to be going from Korea to Venezuela to Doha to the flotilla, the Global Sumud Flotilla, actually like directly from the flotilla, by the way, not just about the issue, the ongoing escalation that's happening in Gaza, I don't know if ramp up is the right word, but we're going to be talking about that as well, and some interesting polling that's coming out. So there's a lot to be said and a lot to cover and a lot for us to continue to talk about as we move forward. And we want to start here with a story out of Georgia, critically important story, but it stretches all the way to the Republic of Korea, South Korea. That is the major raid which took place at a Hyundai plant in Savannah, Georgia, I believe. Man, time is flying. I think this was actually last Thursday, maybe. Man, a lot is happening very quickly. But nonetheless, it's kind of major geopolitical ructions here, a lot of issues about tariffs and things like that. To discuss all of this and more, we are very happy to be joined by Joo-hyun Park, who is a member of Notatal, and I'm very happy to say the web editor at Breakthrough News. Joo-hyun, welcome back.
Eugene, Rania, good to be here as always, amongst colleagues now, I can say.
Yes. Comrades and colleagues, we're now combining things. This is fantastic. Great to have you. And big shout out to you for all the hard work you're doing to help build out the written piece of Breakthrough News. We've had a number of excellent pieces that I hope people are checking out at breakthroughnews.org. But more on that as we move forward in our weeks here. But let's now stick with what happened in Savannah last week. I think it's 316 Korean workers have now, I believe, been flown back to Korea. I mean, I guess here's the thing that is surprising to me, Joo-hyun, is, here's South Korea, which is, obviously very close to the United States. There's this investment in, a battery plant, things that apparently all the U.S. leaders want, in a red state like Georgia that is run by Republicans. And yet and still we have this massive ICE raid, but then very quickly there's a deal that's made. I mean, what do you make of this? Because it feels like there's so many contradictory aspects to how it played out.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that again. Absolutely. I think just to kind of recap, given that this has been an extremely heavy news week, we've had many, many big things happening. The largest ever Department of Homeland Security single site enforcement operation took place last week in the town of Elabella, Georgia, where Hyundai, in partnership with LG, has for the last few years been building an electric vehicle battery plant. Now, this project is a multi-billion-dollar project. It was slated to be, I think, Georgia's largest ever single job creating project. And On top of that, it's something that actually goes back to the Biden administration, because for a number of years, the US has been pursuing policies that are intended through both carrot and stick, bring over industrial capacity from South Korea specifically to the US. And, this battery plant in Georgia was just one of those aspects. Now, just before this raid, we saw a meeting between Lee Jae-myung, the new president of South Korea, and President Trump at the White House, which, on the surface appeared to be very conciliatory. It seemed like, they were getting along famously. At least that was a takeaway from a lot of people. But one thing that was very noteworthy from that meeting was that there was no joint statement that was announced between the two governments. This was ostensibly a meeting to finalize the tariff deal that, the two governments have been negotiating for the past several months now. And while we know that South Korea has already decided that it will put up $350 billion of state-backed investments into US industry, what we don't know is how exactly those funds will be allocated and dispersed. The Trump administration has said that they would like the power for the president to be able to personally decide those allocations. Of course, that is, I think, quite alarming to the South Koreans. They're not necessarily making that public, but I think the longevity and the long time that these negotiations are taking is certainly an indication of things. Now, getting back more specifically into this raid, I have to say this has caused quite an amount of alarm back in South Korea. The footage and the photos of this raid are being circulated widely by media. And we're seeing this very rare moment, actually, where both liberal and conservative outlets and political parties are coming out in denunciation of the Trump administration. So there are many people who are wondering if this could be the start of a sea change in South Korean politics and position towards the US.
Mm. And, to expand on that a bit, you've written a lot about before how there's a very unequal nature to the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea. And I'm curious how you would place this incident in that sort of broader imperial relationship between these two countries.
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. I think on the U.S. side of things, the tariff negotiations tend to be discussed as if they are just kind of another jobs package, or like another bilateral arrangement between nations. The tariff deals that the Trump administration is signing with other governments are very, very bizarre, because what they are essentially asking, or demanding rather, is that foreign governments put up hundreds of billions of dollars, often from their own public purse or connected to their public purse through state-run institutions, and then invest that into the US, which is pitched to the US public as a job creation program. But I think a better way to understand it is that this is kind of a version of the congressional bailouts of Wall Street that we saw in the wake of 2008, only this time it's being financed by taxpayers and citizens around the globe instead of simply by the US public. And so South Korea in particular has been asked to put up this $350 billion package. In addition to that, there were $150 billion additional dollars that were put up by private corporations. There was a separate $100 billion purchase deal for US liquid natural gas. So that's already $600 billion from South Korea, which has an annual GDP of something like 1.7 trillion. So we're talking about a third of South Korea's annual GDP, which is being transferred more or less from the pockets of its working people into the pockets of Wall Street. There's really no other way to put it. This is robbery. I think that, that's really one aspect of the conversation that is really missing from the US side of these things. And I think it explains why, there is so much animosity building in South Korea, because, while there are attempts to pass this off as, successful diplomacy or an opportunity to create investments for the country, I think it is widely understood that this is a fundamentally unequal deal, and that, it's working people that are going to pay the price for this, both in terms of the long-term economic impacts that it has in terms of South Korea's place in the global market, and also just through the loss of, frankly, political sovereignty that is happening, as a result of these deals. And I think what's very interesting to note is that even the right wing, even the business community is beginning to pick up on this. In the wake of the Hyundai raid, I was very surprised to see an editorial from the Korea Economic Daily, which is South Korea's largest business paper. And they said, and I quote, "If the US attempts to leverage this incident in trade negotiations, it would be a betrayal of the trust of the alliance." I think that's very, very strong language. It's frankly, I believe, unprecedented language that we're starting to see from even South Korean conservatives. So politically, this is a very interesting moment. And I think that, some of the concerns being raised in South Korea ought to be taken up within the US as well. We have, these are not fringe outlets. These are mainstream voices that more or less represent, entrepreneurs, the capitalists of South Korea. And, they're openly questioning whether or not this had something to do with the Trump administration's desire to gain leverage in its negotiations with South Korea.
No, I think that's a critically important point, and it's notable. And I also want to note that I think there was one person who chose not to return and is actually pursuing legal action against the Trump administration, I think, for what's going on. But it just brings me to sort of another factor of all of this is I feel that, as much as sort of the issue of immigration and detention centers and others have been, in the news, that because of the sort of particular nature of this, the pictures that you said that I think are causing, a lot of correct consternation in South Korea of people being chained and shackled and all these things. It's also brought that a little bit more out in the United States, I think, in this context. And, obviously, I think the demonization of all immigrants is its own problem. But I think for so many people, it's like, wow, like these people were absolutely like not doing anything wrong, like in the sort of popular perception. And here's how they're still being treated. And I thought the sort of racism of the detention system and the, potential little look we saw into the detention conditions because of this was in and of itself a very revealing moment.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think, this has been quite shocking domestically in the US as well. Of course, there are a lot of people that are against these ICE raids. And I think, previous polling has indicated that even amongst people who prior to the election were in support of increased immigration enforcement, now are changing their tune because they actually have to deal with the consequences and look at the footage of, what happens when families are split apart. But I think, this is also a bit of a watershed moment. It marks a little bit of a qualitative change because this is, no longer just a matter of, the US, conducting so-called domestic enforcement. ICE is now being used as a tool to essentially target and change the relationships with foreign governments. And I think that's territory that we have not really entered before. And I think it'll be interesting over the next few weeks and months to see how other countries and, of course, other South Korean businesses respond, because I think the immediate question that will be raised to investors is, well, if I'm going to put up billions of dollars to invest in a project in the US, how do I know that ICE will not just arrest everyone or even myself, particularly given the fact that in this particular case, it has been reported that there were executives of LG Corporation that were swept up in this raid, right? So that's typically not who you see targeted by these ICE raids. And that's not to say that, there are, some people that deserve to be targeted by ICE raids and others that do not. But I think that noting that change is important politically because it helps us understand how certain actors in the future may change their tune or their orientation, not only towards this administration, but quite possibly to the relationship with the US overall.
Yeah, it is really stunning to see an ICE raid like this being used as a part of like economic trade negotiations in like a very mafia-like fashion. But I do want to ask, how is, I know the Korean American community is not a monolith, but how are Korean Americans maybe responding to this, especially those with maybe connections to labor or anti-imperialist movements?
Well, I think, a lot of progressive organizations have mobilized in the wake of this. There's been a number of efforts by the Nakasek Coalition, for instance, to, ensure the proper treatment, not only of these South Korean nationals, but also the more than 100 Latino workers who were swept up in this raid as well. And from what I've seen in local efforts in Georgia, this actually has been a moment where, different communities and different organizations are able to come together in pursuit of common justice. And, hopefully that is something that will last and that, continues to build into some kind of like sustained, organization, because I do think that is that's sorely needed. I think, amongst Korean Americans, from what I've seen and heard, yeah, this is a widespread topic of conversation in the way that it is in South Korea, and I think that a lot of people who may have previously believed, erroneously, of course, that, this mass deportation crackdown would not affect them are starting to realize that actually, no one really is safe. And I think that, others who have been a little bit more hip to things, a little more in the know are, hopefully, and I think rightfully taking this as an opportunity to bring more people in and to, try to enhance the kind of political coalitions that could be possible. So As we always say, organizing is the solution in the face of, the kind of unrepentant terror of the ruling class. And I think that this is a moment where, we have an opportunity to bring more people in, to bring more folks into alliance who previously have not worked together. And I'm just hoping that, everyone who is operating around this issue from many different parts of the political spectrum realize the importance of unity in this time, and that, that can be realized in the coming months and years.
Mm-hmm. And, to the point that you have been raising about sort of the geopolitical realities of this, I mean, it's interesting to see this in juxtaposition to what we saw, just last week, vis-a-vis when we're talking about the two Koreas. I mean, you have Kim Jong-un, who is there with President Xi and President Putin at this large, and many other presidents, I think 32 all told, commemoration there in China around the 80th anniversary of the end of the war on fascism. And, the whole world is sort of marking like, this looks a little bit more like the future in some ways, and the shift in the world and the things that are happening. And then, here you are having South Korea, which has been doubling down on its relationship with the United States. And here your so-called ally is just humiliating you and abusing your citizens. I mean, it just felt like an interesting juxtaposition vis-a-vis sort of where the world is going and what kind of geopolitical alliances seem more stable than others.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very pertinent point. I think that the fact that these events happened in the same week is incredibly telling. And, I think in many ways, South Korea seems to have missed an opportunity. There was a representative of the government that was present, but Lee Jae-myung, the head of state himself, was not present, in Beijing. And so I think that, I think there will probably be a recalculation that will happen in the coming months. And I think that we're in a very interesting moment because we even have people attacking Lee Jae-myung from the right at this point, saying that, he needs to take a firmer stance towards the US, that, they can't allow for South Korean companies or workers to be pushed around in this way. And I think that, inevitably what will probably need to result is that, South Korea will need to diversify and strengthen a lot of its foreign relations, which, Lee Jae-myung has indicated some openness to doing in the past. And now I think the question is, will he follow through on those things? Will he seize the opportunity to potentially, give South Korea a little bit more of a neutral position in the region, politically at least, in a way that, could actually result in greater opportunities and greater independence in the long run for the Korean people?
I just want to throw out there, too, that obviously this isn't as dramatic and theatrical and I guess as like horrifying to actual people as the ICE raid was. But it was just reported a bit before we started recording that Mexico will be raising tariffs on Chinese, I think, cars by like 50%. But Asian countries more generally, and one of the other top countries hit is South Korea to try. That's all under U.S. pressure. And also to try to like appease the U.S. in their own trade talks. But it is interesting to see how like even in these other countries that do want to do trade with the rest of the world, particularly with the Asian market, that the U.S. is enforcing these pressures not just against China, but also against its own allies in terms of a country like Mexico, which is a really big market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very interesting. I actually had not heard of that up until now, but I know that
just happened. Yeah.
Oh, it just happened. Okay. Yeah. I know a lot of Korean automakers are, very, very active in Mexico in terms of production. And so, my assumption would be that if the US is applying that kind of pressure on Mexico, part of what they're trying to achieve is also to ensure US dominance in auto manufacturing, so that, even if the company is not, doesn't have a US brand technically, that, if they're building everything in the US and they need to do that in order to access markets in Latin America overall, or in Mexico specifically, that's just another kind of feather in the cap of the Trump administration in terms of its ability to apply pressure on these companies. And I think, this will take a long time to work itself out. There will be a lot of competing interests at play. But I think fundamentally, what people need to wake up and realize is that the US is not playing for mutual prosperity. The US is playing basically a form of economic vampirism, right? They're trying to just suck out all the production capacity from, these countries that it previously exported production to, and what will be left of economies like South Korea at the end of that process. I think those are very, very important questions that should be asked by the political classes, by, the organized workers, not just in South Korea, but across the global South, because of course, Korea is not the only country facing these kinds of threats.
No, that's absolutely right. Well, there's a lot to follow here and a lot to continue watching, and we will continue to follow it and watch it. And we appreciate you as always, Joo-hyun Park, member of Noted Tall and web editor at Breakthrough News. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me on.
Rania?
Well, Eugene, it just sounds to me like the mafia state of America is using its pressure tactics in really absurd ways to try to rig the entire, quote unquote, free market system all around the world. It's such a joke to even call it that.
You know, it's funny you say that because that's a great segue into our next story, which is about some real mafia-like behavior as well. And that is what's happening in Venezuela, in and around Venezuela, the massive, very significant U.S. forces that have been moved to the region. Obviously, they had the alleged strike against this alleged drug boat off of the coast of Venezuela. And now, you know, Trump continuing to rattle the saber and you know, genuflect towards the possibility of some sort of strike on Venezuela. So to discuss this, we are very honored to be joined here on the show by Jose Luis Granado Ceja, who's a staff writer at Venezuela Analysis, and also, by the way, a presenter on Sin Muros, who is a great show on Mexico's Canal Once. Thank you so much for being with us, Jose Luis.
Thank you much for having me. It's always good to be here with you.
Well, it's great to have you. And, you know, I saw President Maduro yesterday made a point about this. I think he was being interviewed by Rafael Correa, and he said, it's not really about the cocaine, it's about the oil in terms of what is happening vis-a-vis Trump and Venezuela right now. What do you think about that? How do you evaluate that statement?
Yeah, I think Maduro is absolutely right. This is only the latest in a very long series of efforts to engage in regime change and to oust the government of Nicolás Maduro, which the United States obviously sees as a threat to its hegemony in Latin America. It's very much about the resources as well. It's about Venezuela's oil. It continues to be the country with the largest reserves on the planet, but of course it's other resources as well, which is also gold and rare earths and all the rest of it. You know, the United States is driven by its interests, I think particularly with more recent developments at the world stage, in having Latin America as a place where it can have cheap labor and cheap resources. And Venezuela, as a country that has been through a revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution, having started with the election of Hugo Chavez in 1999, obviously represents a threat to that hegemony. It's also about sending a message to Latin America that the United States will not stop when it comes to its efforts to try to oust governments that it finds inconvenient or a threat to its authority in the region.
You know, we're hearing the U.S. brand Venezuela as this narco state, right? And Maduro is just this big narco dictator, you know, whatever. How credible is this claim? And what do you think the real purpose of this label is?
Yeah, it's absolutely, there's no credibility to it whatsoever. It's quite disturbing to see the way that they try to manufacture consent for these kinds of actions against the Venezuelan people and towards the Venezuelan government in particular. And, you know, this notion, for example, around Tren de Aragua, right? It's this gang that started in the Tocoron prison in Venezuela. It's been largely eradicated inside of Venezuela. There was a very strong campaign coming from the executive there, from Maduro, to eliminate the influence this organization has. It does have a presence, I think, particularly amongst the Venezuelan migrant communities. They've been heavily involved in some of the human trafficking, but their role is deliberately overstated. The aim is to try to demonize, I think, on the one hand, the Venezuelan people as a whole. We obviously saw massive waves of Venezuelan migrants arrive to the United States as a result of U.S. imperialism, U.S. interference inside of Venezuela, attempts to quite literally destroy that economy. And of course, you know, this effort to try to demonize the Venezuelan population because of their, you know, these large numbers that arrived in recent years, and to justify Trump's mass deportation campaign. But of course, it's also about the regime change. It's also about trying to demonize the Venezuelan government. There is no basis to this allegation that, for example, that Maduro is the head of a cartel. There really is no evidence to speak of, no court-tested evidence to say that this actually even exists. It's that much of a stretch of the imagination. You know, it's something that's being instrumentalized in order to achieve their foreign policy aims. And for example, the Tren de Aragua, to go back to that, right? It does exist. I'm not going to say that it is a total figment of someone's imagination, but the Tren de Aragua is not the kind of organization, I think, for example, comparable to some of the organized crime groups that you might find in Mexico. This is something that has been is overstated. If anything, it's kind of almost like a brand that certain individuals have kind of taken up upon themselves to use to try to advance their own interests as criminal actors in the region. But the disturbing thing is the way that the United States is trying to leverage it. And I think, for example, comments that we've heard from Marco Rubio, just flatly saying, "Oh, it's not the U.S. government. This is an indictment from a court in the Southern District of New York." I mean, there is a reason why that saying is often put forward when we're talking about grand jury indictments. You can indict a ham sandwich if you wanted to. There's really no basis to this. It's Marco Rubio engaging in rhetorical exercises to justify the unjustifiable, because I think it's worth remembering that this strike on this alleged drug boat, it is very clearly, by any definition, a violation of international law. And there was a recent report that actually seemed to suggest that the boat was retreating and that they actually attacked it in order to kill any survivors. And so even if we were to accept some of these outlandish arguments being put forward by the State Department right now, suggesting that they represented an imminent threat, which it probably wasn't, because that boat of that size is not going to make it from Venezuela all the way to the United States. It's quite likely it was headed to a Caribbean island. Well, even if we were to say, okay, it does represent an imminent threat, that was retreating, and the actions that they took clearly are a violation of international law, what we have is a bunch of fanatics running foreign policy in the United States right now.
And I think, that's the fear, especially when they've assembled so much military force, including 10 F-35s moves to Puerto Rico. And talk about the response in Venezuela, because we've seen quite a bit of, I think, discontent with the Trump policy. I've even seen some people who are part of the opposition, express some level of opposition to this move by the United States. So talk about what we're seeing on the ground in Venezuela in terms of the response.
Yeah, of course, we have to recognize that there are various different kinds of oppositions. There's really radical far-right opposition that does exist in Venezuela, but there's also a democratic opposition that recognizes that its role is to provide alternatives to what the government is putting forward in terms of its policies. And, we've seen a response from some of these critics to say that we would not tolerate a U.S. attack on Venezuela. And even some of the left critics of the Maduro government, people who might, consider themselves to be to the left of the government, have said the same thing. They have it quite clear that when it comes to a threat against the Venezuelan territory, to Venezuelan sovereignty, that it's time to close ranks, that this is not tolerable whatsoever. It really is quite useful, I think, in some ways, to see the people who do seem to want to have this kind of attack. It says everything you need to know about what is their vision, what is their understanding of their role inside of Venezuela, and they're basically compradors, right? They are agents of U.S. imperialism. They don't actually have a national interest. They don't defend national interest whatsoever. They are there to put forward and advance the interests of U.S. imperialism. There was actually, this came up in the interview between Correa and Maduro, where in the case of Ecuador, you're also seeing a former president actually call for the bombing of his own country. There's a term we use here in Latin America and in Spanish, vende patrias, people who sell out their homeland. That's how these people should be understood, because it's quite egregious to even suggest the notion, because the U.S. uses this kind of euphemistic language, surgical strikes and all the rest of it, but there's nothing surgical about it. If they do actually decide to commit an attack inside of Venezuelan territory or any territory in the region, that's going to lead to the deaths of innocents. It's going to lead to bloodshed of people who have nothing to do with it. And even if they are criminal actors, then they should face justice. They shouldn't be assassinated with bombs falling on them from the sky. So be wary of anybody who's calling for that. These are the same voices that I think are also the ones that are so frequently featured in U.S. media as so-called champions of democracy. And of course, I'm talking about people like Maria Corina Machado, who also, important to say, backed U.S. sanctions against Venezuela, which has led to the deaths of, thousands of people. One report found that in 1 year from CEPR, that 40,000 people were negatively impacted in terms of their health as a result of these sanctions. So, these people who call sanctions are also willing to entertain this notion of U.S. unilateral military action inside of the territory. And of course, finally, I would say that you have to reject this in a generalized way, because as much as this is very much a message to Venezuela, the U.S. has made it clear that they don't view Maduro as legitimate, that they're willing to engage in violations of international law in order to put pressure on him. This is a message for the region. This is the United States, I think, I am operating under the hypothesis that there seem to be moving into a period of kind of a strategic withdrawal back into the Western Hemisphere. And so they want to make it clear that under this administration, under this White House, they're willing to do just about anything to ensure their hegemony over this region, because they view it in a very kind of specific way. It's a disgusting term, but it's the way that they use all the time, which is as their backyard, right? The return of kind of the ugliest face of the Monroe Doctrine. And I think it's very important, from Ecuador to Mexico to Venezuela to Brazil, everywhere, to be very clear that these kinds of actions cannot be tolerated and must be rejected absolutely and completely, because if that precedent is allowed to be established, they will repeat it throughout the region, and that would be devastating for all of the working class people of this region.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it to that sort of zoomed out context. I mean, really what I think you see in this hitting this drone strike on the boat and then these military threats against Venezuela is the U.S. really entering a phase of just brute force everywhere. It's kind of like the Gaza logic being applied to everything, right? And I imagine that countries around Venezuela, regional allies, and then even ones who aren't allies, would be looking at this and maybe getting a little concerned, because that means, the U.S. gets away with this sort of thing. What's the U.S. going to do the next time it doesn't get what it wants from your country? Just going to bomb you? So all that's to say, how are Venezuela's regional allies responding? Countries like Cuba, Bolivia, maybe even Brazil. I don't know, has Mexico said anything? Is there any coordinated pushback?
I think we've seen a very important pushback. I think I failed to mention this earlier. Definitely domestically inside of Venezuela, we've seen the mobilization of millions of people who were already signed up or weren't, decided to sign up and join the Bolivarian militia as a means of showing their solidarity with the government and to show that they are willing to put their lives on the line to defend their territory. I think that is the absolutely most correct response. I've called it a glorious response, to see the people basically turning out to all of the Plaza Bolivars everywhere throughout the country to sign up. And I think it's also important to send a message. But regionally, I think it's also been really encouraging to see, for example, CELAC countries issue a statement to condemn these kind of actions. It wasn't a universal statement, unanimous statement. Unfortunately, there are countries in the region. There's a couple actually in the Caribbean that have been quite worrisome response. Actually, we saw, the governor of Puerto Rico talk about how she's more than happy to see her country used as a launching point for these kinds of attacks. Worrisome statements from Jamaica and from Trinidad and Tobago. But we did see a very strong majority of members of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, CELAC, come out and say this clearly. And we did see Lula also actually talk to BRICS countries to say we have to take a position against recent U.S. actions in the region at the upcoming UN General Assembly. So there is, importantly, I think, even from leaders who are seen as, closer to the center than they are to the left, like Lula, making clear, and I think it's exactly what you said. I think there's an understanding here in the region that if we allow this precedent, it could be used as a pressure tactic or a threat against any country, especially the smaller states. The United States really is a bully, and it tries to bully around smaller states. For example, the day that this came out in the news about this attack on this alleged drug boat, Marco Rubio was arriving in Mexico. And a lot of people were speculating if it was also actually a message for Mexico. Mexico has a very strong defense of its sovereignty under the government of Claudia Sheinbaum. It's a red line for this government not to tolerate that. And we saw that Marco Rubio had to, agree to this security arrangement where they not signed, but a memorandum of understanding that they would not violate Mexican sovereignty, for example. But, Mexico has the ability to negotiate that way with the United States, I think in a lot of ways because of the close relationship, the physical proximity, the important trade relationships. Not all countries have that luxury. And so that's why there has to be a very strong position. And shame on all those world leaders who have not spoken out against this, particularly those here from the region who refused to sign on to that statement. You can have all the differences you want with Nicolás Maduro and the Venezuelan government, but I think it's very clear that there are certain things that should never, ever be crossed. And then one of them is, of course, respect for sovereignty. We have to understand that this isn't, the 19th or the 20th century where the United States can come around and violate sovereignty in the ways that they have done historically, because that eventually is going to come up against even allies. We've seen it before that the U.S. turns against one-time allies in the region. It is a very short-sighted way of approaching policy with the United States.
Well, a lot to all of this, and it's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds. Hopefully the situation will de-escalate quicker than, might be expected given Trump's threats. But we really appreciate you coming on, helping us sort through it all. Jose Luis Granado Ceja, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much for having me.
Some breaking news, Rania, from Latin America here before we transition. The Supreme Court of Brazil has found former President Jair Bolsonaro guilty of plotting a military coup against the government. And we'll have to wait to see what the sentencing is going to be, but it could be many decades in prison, and he's an older gentleman, so that could be the rest of his life, depending on how they sentence him. But major event there in Brazil, and I'm sure there will be many ructions from this.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty interesting justice, to say the least.
Yeah.
I also just want to say, Eugene, with regard to what's happening in Venezuela, I was thinking to myself, obviously the Trump administration has taken this to a new level, but they did designate drug cartels as terrorists, and they did that for a reason. They did that because that would give them the legal framework they need to target them. And I want to take this back to, you remember when Obama was in charge? And he was expanding the U.S.'s ability to carry out extrajudicial killings based on the war on terror terrorist framework, and basically extended it to mean anybody they say is in Al-Qaeda who's a male of a certain age, right, military age male, can be targeted for death, for execution by drone without a trial. And a lot of people at the time, I was still young, and I'm not even sure maybe I was becoming a journalist or not quite a journalist yet, but I remember a lot of people at the time were warning liberals. They were like, you know what, you guys are cool with this now, just you wait. And I see this happening. And I mean, you can't have Trump doing what he's doing without those legal precedents that were set under somebody who was wasn't he a civil rights lawyer or something?
Civil rights and constitutional law. Although, apparently the people at University of Chicago Law School, apparently he was not very well liked because they said that all he did was sit in his office and write his memoir, and people were like, what has that guy ever done? Because he wrote that first memoir before he did anything. So he allegedly was a civil rights lawyer, but what did he do? Who knows? But the point you're making is very well taken, that, as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Not that he even had good intentions, but there's a prehistory here that, is bipartisan.
Well, he had those kill list Mondays or something, when he would they would make their kill list for the drone strikes, just completely insane.
Yeah, he said he wanted to personally approve them, unlike Bush, who I guess said he didn't want to personally approve them. But it's as if that makes it better that when you look at people, kids and collateral damage, that you were yep, let's do that one. I mean, it really is amazing. But that's the beauty of America. You know what I mean? If you are the president, you have total carte blanche to kill anyone anywhere around the world, but if you're just somebody, a homeless person, doing a small amount of drugs on the street, they want to throw you in prison for 20 years. I mean, it really is wild situation. Well, speaking of wild situations, of which there are many, in case you missed it, anybody out here watching, Israel bombed Doha, the capital of Qatar, in an attempt to kill the Hamas negotiating team and really elements of Hamas's leadership that are there as a part of the broader negotiations that are, allegedly about bringing the genocide to an end and various different things. But ultimately, here we are, big escalation in a major way on, a very important global state, small state, but plays a big role in global affairs. So to talk more about all of this and its repercussions, we are very, very honored to be joined once again by Giorgio Cafiero, who's the CEO of Gulf State Analytics. Giorgio, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be with you guys.
Well, great to have you with us as always. And there's a lot to be said about this. I mean, I almost don't even know where to start. This was pretty shocking to me. Maybe I shouldn't have been shocked, but obviously, Qatar plays a big role in a lot of different global conflicts in terms of being a site of negotiation, a place where two sides can hash things out, and really is being a neutral arbiter that a lot of people around the world respect in terms of the ability to help facilitate these processes. And it seemed like they were playing this role, vis-a-vis what's been going on in Palestine. I mean, what are the repercussions of this, not just for Palestine, but for the overall issue of Doha as a site where, different forms of negotiations can take place?
Yeah, those are some really important questions. Definitely some very big questions. I think it's important to note that what the Israelis were one of Israel's objectives here was to really completely destroy the negotiations process. It is a really extreme move on Israel's part to target the third country that was hosting the negotiations that Israel and the United States were involved in. So I think the negotiations process is obviously dead. And I think what Israel wants to do is move ahead with the genocide and campaign of annihilation in Gaza with all its momentum and not pursue any sort of negotiations with Hamas through the Qatari channel or really any other channel right now. There are huge implications, though, because this strike is going to force not only Qatar, but the other Gulf Arab states to look at the security landscape very differently. Qatar, like the other GCC states, has long depended on the U.S. security umbrella to stay safe. And up until 2 days ago, the GCC countries were off limits to Israeli military aggression. That obviously came to an end. And so right now, the GCC states are not able to look at the United States the same way. Qatar is a non-NATO a major non-NATO ally of the U.S., the largest U.S. military footprint in the Middle East. This is the U.S. CENTCOM forward headquarters is based right outside of Doha at the Al Udeid base. Right now, the Qataris are wondering, what does any of this do to provide Qatar with security? The other GCC states are wondering the same thing too. So this is really creating a tremendous amount of concern in the Gulf, where leaders and policymakers are absolutely terrified about this new dynamic in which the Israelis can bomb a Gulf Arab capital and basically face no consequences, and do it with the U.S., if not, I wouldn't say the U.S. outright encouraged Israel to do it, but this is only possible because the U.S. allowed one of its allies to attack a GCC country.
Giorgio, I'm wondering how countries like Saudi Arabia or the Emirates might be feeling about all this. I mean, obviously, they're not fans of the Qataris. Certainly, they don't like Hamas and wouldn't necessarily ever host them or anything like that. However, this demonstrates, like you said, I mean, the U.S. is supposed to be the security guarantor of these countries. And to just stand by and allow Israel to do as it pleases, or maybe even be complicit in it, who actually knows what the Trump administration did here, right? Suggests that hosting American bases does not protect you. Being subservient or allied with the Americans does not protect you from an increasingly reckless and deranged Israeli regime that wants a region of total hegemony. And I mean, if I'm Saudi Arabia, I might be thinking to myself, like, today it's Hamas. What if tomorrow they're upset about some economic deal? What, are they just going to bomb us and they can just do that now? Maybe not. Saudi Arabia is not thinking that, but I would be thinking that. I would be scared sitting in the region, no matter how close I was to the Americans, no matter how much I don't care about the genocide in Gaza. I would not want a region where Israel gets to be this hegemon that just has complete impunity everywhere. And so, yeah, I'm just curious what you think the conversations might be like in these states like the Emirates and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's recall that it was back in May when Trump went to Doha. He secured massive deals with the Qataris. They gave him, famously that they gifted him that luxurious jumbo jet. And there's a very special military relationship, defense relationship between the US and Qatar. So the other 5 GCC states have to be wondering, if Qatar was not protected from Israel, what do we have that Doha didn't have? And so they have to consider that if there's ever a figure from an organization that Israel deems a quote unquote terrorist group, what's to stop Israel from bombing, that individual on their soil? Let's also keep in mind, while there's the Hamas office in Doha, the Houthis were engaged in hostilities with Israel. They have a diplomatic presence in Oman, which has been the main location for Houthi dialogue with Western countries and Arab countries. So the Omanis have to certainly be concerned that Israel might target Oman under the premise of going after the Houthis. So all the GCC states basically feel that this attack on Qatar was really an attack on the GCC as an institution, and they all feel very threatened right now. You are right that in the past there's a whole history of tension between UAE and Qatar, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. But right now, the Gulf Arab monarchies are in a moment of solidarity with each other. I think their unity is going to strengthen. The fact that the president of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, showed up in Doha the day after the attack. Mohammed bin Salman is using very strong language to condemn the Israeli aggression against Saudi Arabia's neighbor in the Gulf, also speaks to this dynamic. And we should point out that right now the GCC states, in this period of feeling very vulnerable to Israel's rogue and frankly lunatic behavior, they're going to seek new ways to achieve security. They do not believe that they can count on the U.S. as they did count on the U.S. in the past. There is not really any other country in the world, though, that has the A, willingness, and B, capacity to replace the United States as a security guarantor for all of the GCC states. So I think probably right now, the Gulf Arab monarchies of the GCC are going to try to focus on becoming more autonomous when it comes to their defense, building up military capacities that enable them to deter attacks and to carry out strikes in retaliation. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. This is a long-term project. But I think as a consequence of Israel bombing Doha 2 days ago, the Gulf Arab states are going to become more serious about trying to become more autonomous from the United States.
Well, that would certainly be momentous on multiple different levels. And in one area that, I think is notable in this regards in terms of many moves is whether or not you also think that there's a possibility that there could be increased diplomatic efforts by the Gulf states to, bring some sort of, further opprobrium on to Israel. I mean, I saw the PM of Qatar said, that Netanyahu must be brought to justice. Now, of course, Netanyahu isn't really leaving Israel, but, there's growing conversations. I mean, Smotrich and Ben Gvir have been banned from a number of European countries. I don't think it's going to happen, but obviously this threat in the UK of Isaac Herzog being arrested and the Friends of Al-Aqsa going to court to try to get him arrested. I would assume that if, the Gulf Arab states start to push more for, European countries and African countries and Latin American countries to deny airspace and, all these other places, that could stiffen the spine of people in other countries who are worried about blowback if they push to isolate Israel more. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think the Gulf Arab states are going to be trying to convince more countries around the world to come to their defense and to take certain actions against Israel. I think, though, probably the most delicate and important question to look at is the state of relations between the two GCC states that have formalized diplomatic relations with Israel. It was this month, 5 years ago this month, the UAE and Bahrain entered into formal diplomatic relations with Israel. They normalized with Israel through the Abraham Accords. So a main question that many are asking right now is, is there a possibility of the UAE or Bahrain pulling out of those normalization deals? I think probably right now at this point, we cannot expect either the UAE or Bahrain to go that far, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were to possibly downgrade diplomatic relations with Israel, make their rhetoric against Israel increasingly bold. And then if there are additional Israeli strikes on Doha or any other part of the Gulf, I think that's a card that they might choose to play down the line. I don't think they're going to do this at once, but that is some real leverage that two of Qatar's fellow GCC states do have. That would be a move that they could theoretically make, which would force Israel to pay a huge price for its rogue behavior in the Gulf.
Really stunning, because you have Netanyahu making this statement. I think it was maybe just yesterday, saying, like, speaking directly to the countries, but also saying to all countries sheltering, quote unquote terrorists, expel them or bring them to justice, or we will. And then saying we're no different from America after 9/11. And then saying countries condemning Israel should be ashamed, blah, 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 blah. But all that's to say, I mean, that the message there, and the Israelis have been saying this for a couple of weeks, is that we're going to pursue Hamas abroad, right? And they obviously chose Doha over Istanbul for a reason. I mean, I think there would have been more consequences to hitting Hamas officials in a place like Istanbul. Turkey has a very, qualified military, very decent weapons. They know how to fight wars. They've done it recently, regardless of what you think about those wars. So all that's to say, I think the Israelis recognize there are more consequences to that. However, a few weeks ago, if you told me that the Israelis would bomb Doha, I would have called you crazy. So what are the chances this extends at some point to Turkey? And could we, do you foresee a scenario where the Israelis are messing with Turkey that way, and there's like a broader war between the two of them playing out? Because, I don't have any romantic ideas of Turkey taking on the Israelis, but I do think if they were attacked by the Israelis, they would actually fight back.
Well, obviously, the most important point to bring up here is that Turkey's a NATO member. So there is Article 5 that has to be considered. That would do a lot more to test NATO than the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine. Of course, keep in mind, Ukraine partnered with NATO countries, but it's not an official NATO ally. Turkey actually is. So, I mean, let's be honest. What if Israel is going to attack Turkey? Is the United States going to come to Turkey's defense? I don't think that would happen. So then that really would demonstrate that NATO as an alliance is totally obsolete. That would raise the stakes very high. I also do not think that any European countries would take military action against Israel if they did that. That's a very serious scenario to consider. I have learned in the post-October 7th world that it's very foolish to say, oh, Israel would never do this. I think it's possible that Netanyahu would not be so foolish as to do that. But I don't want to say this is something Israel would never do. I think it's not wise to rule out anything at this point.
Well, this is why we always bring you on, Giorgio, because you're very level-headed and very calm, cool, and collected about not making any wild predictions, but just giving us the facts as we know them and from your excellent sources all across the region. So we are honored to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Giorgio Cafiero, CEO of Gulf State Analytics, and I have to say, a new doting father as well. Congratulations to you and your wife.
Thank you both. We'll see you next time.
Rania.
Well, Eugene, speaking of crazy Israel, it's alleged or believed that the Israelis are responsible for a couple drone attacks on the two boats carrying participants in the Global Sumud Flotilla, which we've been covering here at Breakthrough News since they launched a little over a week ago from the port in Barcelona. They were docked in Tunis for a couple days this past week, where two of the boats were struck by an incendiary device launched against them by a drone. They can't, they don't know 100% it was the Israelis, but I mean, who else is going to be doing that? I think in both cases, it started a small fire and did a little bit of damage, but not too much. So both boats were still able to launch from the dock in Tunis on their way to Gaza. We actually got a chance. Well, I got a chance to pre-record an interview with one of the participants on one of those boats, Tadhg Hickey. He is a comedian and activist. He's actually on the same boat as Layla Hagazi, who we spoke to last week. So they're keeping each other company over there. So let's go ahead and watch that interview. I am so honored to be joined on the Freedom Side Live by Tadhg Hickey. He is a comedian, an activist, and he is coming to us from the Global Sumud Flotilla. Tadhg, welcome to the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. This is definitely a test in terms of the technicalities. I might have to imagine some of your questions, but we'll do what we can. Yeah, you're joining me live from the Global Sumud Flotilla, where I think one of your favorite sisters, Layla Hagazi, is also on the same boat as me. So we're just trying to keep each other sane in all this in the last little while. So yeah, good fun.
Well, I'm glad that you and Layla have each other. We had Layla on last week. We have you on this week, and quite a bit has happened since then. You all docked this week at the port in Tunis, and the Israelis attacked 2 boats. They attacked one of the boats of some of your comrades, and then they also attacked your boat. But you guys sailed anyway. So tell us what happened.
Yeah, it's been an interesting few days. So we were in Tunisia for a while. It kind of felt like we were starting to outstay our welcome in Tunisia, not because of the Tunisian people. They obviously probably one of the most pro-Palestine countries in the world. But the Tunisian government is under enormous diplomatic pressure, as all your listeners will intuitively understand. They probably are under a lot of pressure for this mission not to proceed from Tunis. And it felt like the longer we were there, we were starting to become a target for infiltration and sabotage and whatnot. And because, as you know, Rania, we've got to give the serial killer the benefit of the doubt. So we don't know exactly who attacked us 2 nights in a row. I think we can probably rule out the Bahamas and Sierra Leone, but there are other countries that might be, suspicious. But so we've had 2 nights in a row of attacks. My boat and Layla's boat, as I say, was victim the second night. I just finished my nighttime security shift, and we're well drilled. We all know our roles. And then suddenly there was a bright light above our heads, a loud noise, and the top deck was on fire. And 2 or 3 eyewitnesses and a really fairly conclusive video illustrating that it's a drone bringing an incendiary device, probably a grenade. People are thinking now, people who understand this a lot better than I do are doing independent investigations into it. But you may or may not have seen that the news certainly that went around Ireland initially was that the Tunisian authority said there was no drone and that the likely cause was a cigarette. So I have to just tell your listeners that I'm very privileged to see with my own eyes actually a giant cigarette propelling through the sky and setting my boat on fire. Who knew that cigarettes could be so malevolent,
Well, I do want to ask you, obviously, whoever was behind this was trying to intimidate you, but you all have chosen to stay on your boat and to continue on your journey. So tell me, were you afraid? Did you reconsider your decision to join the flotilla after this happened?
Well, I've been saying to people, on a human level, you have some people at home who are understandably starting to crack ever so slightly. My family totally support the mission. As you probably know, the vast majority of Ireland stands with Palestine in a meaningful way. That solidarity with substance is not just kind of sharing a post 2 years into a genocide, as long as it doesn't affect your career too much. There's solidarity with substance all over Ireland. So people respect and they give me their blessing, I suppose. But then people who care about me don't want me to die. They don't want me to be killed. And actually, they don't want me to be killed, and they don't want my Irish media and the rest of the craven Western media to report on the incident from the perspective of the country committing genocide over the last 2 years. That would be one of my main concerns, that I could be killed over here and my family will never seek justice because Western media is so craven. They will report from the serial killer's perspective over the last 2 years. So to answer your question on a human level, of course, it comes to your mind, I've got young kids, I've got a 16-week-old child. I would rather not be here in many ways. If my government just had a bit of balls and acted and sanctioned this country and did something meaningful, I would probably rather go home and spend time with my kids. But in terms of the activists here, it's just actually strengthened our resolve, if anything, because it's the classic behavior of a bully. And you can't bow down to bullies. Everything that's wrong with the world right now is because too many people have bowed down to bullies and they've been able to get away with anything they want. I mean, in the case of Israel, Israel has shown a degree of impunity that I don't think we've ever seen in modern times. I mean, every time you pick up your newspaper, they've bombed another country. And I just don't know where that goes unless we stand up to it. And I think in our own small, tiny little way on this mission, we're just saying no, that we just don't accept a world like this. We're not going to continue to watch Palestinians being starved to death and exterminated. If our governments won't act, then we will act, because it's not about us. It's about the most beleaguered, forgotten population on earth right now they're literally just getting ready to die in some cases. Layla was talking to me just a while ago about somebody she's speaking to in Gaza who's effectively given up. And not in a depressed way, just in an absolute kind of acceptance that nobody is going to intervene and help these people during their own extermination. I mean, what kind of a world are we living in? Are we bringing up kids in that's a reality for Palestinians right now? And it's a reality that we're at the very least challenging and battling.
You know, you mentioned you're from Ireland, and this seems to be an issue that's very near and dear to you. And I'm just curious, what got you onto the issue of Palestine? Is this something that you grew up understanding? Is this something that you understood more later? I imagine, of course, the last 2 years, regardless of where you stood before that, has made you even more determined to be active for the liberation of Palestine. But yeah, walk me through your political journey on this issue.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that for a long time, if you actually consider yourself an anti-imperialist, if you consider yourself a lefty, if you consider yourself somebody who just gives a shit about other human beings, like, Palestine is where it's all won and lost. You know what I mean? It's the most important moral issue of our time, as Nelson Mandela said. So I don't understand how somebody could describe themselves as left-leaning or a socialist or just somebody who cares about other human beings and not be very passionate about Palestine. And then, obviously, on a historical level, like the same colonial playbook that was used against Ireland so effectively is literally being used against Palestine for the last 70 or 80 years, except on a scale that we haven't seen before. I mean, like, just one quick example would be like the most brutal military force that Ireland ever saw, the Black and Tans, which targeted civilians in Ireland with impunity. Some of those actual soldiers, the literal same soldiers, left Ireland after the War of Independence in Ireland and then went to Palestine. So it's not just a spiritual connection. In some cases, it's literal. So we understand all the same dehumanization, being labeled as terrorists for just having the temerity to fight back against occupation. I think Ireland is in a unique position in Europe where it just kind of understands resistance and why it's a necessary thing. It's not like we love violence or we're mad to get our balaclavas on and start shooting people. It's just because we understand that, unfortunately, when you're dealing with brutal empire, you have to fight back or you're destroyed. So that's why I think there's an affinity with, not just in terms of resistance, but just in terms of the humanity, I think, of people who are oppressed in the world. That I think it's a unique position that Ireland has really in Europe to have that level of empathy and meaningful understanding.
And, you know, I remember earlier this year, you know, you were in Lebanon during Nasrallah's funeral. And I, you know, it was after a massive Israeli bombardment campaign that left a significant portion of Lebanon in rubble. And so I'm just curious, you know, what did you take away from visiting Lebanon during that time, and how do you relate it to your understanding of what Israel's doing in Palestine?
Well, one of my only regrets when I was in Lebanon is that we didn't get to meet up. I think you were a little under the weather at the time, and I had limited time. But
I was.
But no, genuinely, I mean, like, I'm obsessed with Lebanon. Like, if I in another world, if I didn't have kids in Ireland, I would happily live in Beirut. I just thought it was the most eclectic, and the people are just so beautiful and full of compassion, and they give you the shirt off their back, bring you to their home, make you food. My take from Lebanon, I suppose, was an even deeper understanding of how there are vast swathes of the world that don't seem to qualify as victims at all. They don't qualify almost as human beings, you know? Like I watched your fantastic documentary about the pager attacks recently, and it reminded me because I'd met some of the similar people who featured in your doc. And I just thought as well at the time, these people don't matter to the West. They're not part of the narrative. They're not seen. It's just a case of this pager attack was carried out by a Western ally, and look how amazing the West is, and you know, look how amazing Israel is, like, with their cutting edge technology. You can only have that perspective if you don't view Lebanese as actual human beings, fellow human beings. There's no way that children would be maimed and blind, and so many victims, as you know as well as I do, not military people at all, like interior designers, academics. There's just no way that you would be able to do that to white people and still frame it as a victory for technological military revolution. There's just no way you'd be able to do that. So that level of hypocrisy, it sickens me. And if I was to do anything with my life, if I was able to just shed light on it, call it out and humanize the dehumanized, weirdly through the prism of comedy, then that's what I'm just going to do with the rest of my life. And I'd be happy enough for that little contribution.
Well, you're very good at doing that. And I do want to ask you, you know, you have been so outspoken against the genocide. You've experienced quite a bit of censorship because of it. I know that your Instagram account and YouTube page have been suspended, and then your TikTok page, and then, you know, you've been given it back, but also like that's to, you know, make sure you know that this could happen again. So I'm just curious, you know, how has this, I guess, what is the censorship that you've faced over this issue? Because it seems like it's been quite a bit.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I face some censorship, but without making the obvious point again, like when you think of what people in Lebanon are going through, when you think of primarily what people in Palestine are going through, in Yemen, in Syria, Rani's one of your biggest fans, then it pales into insignificance. And I think my bottom line on this is like, what is the function of art? For me, the function of art, particularly comedy, all the satirists that I admire growing up, they all provoked. They didn't try to become famous. They didn't say, I'm going to get X amount of followers on Instagram and then I'll get a paid partnership with Coca-Cola. They were aiming to try and influence people's opinions on things that they might have had static or fixed ideas on. And it was provocative and it hurt people in power. It punched up. So any repercussion I get, I'm very willing and able to take it. There was a big piece in Sky News Australia about myself and Tiago being terrorist supporters because we were at Hassan Nasrallah's funeral, and I watched the clip and the only emotion I felt was, oh my God, do you remember that time? That was such a lovely time. And I was watching some images of Lebanon and Beirut, and I thought to myself, if my time over again, the only thing I would change is that I would get more footage because I miss it so much. So I have no regrets. I understand the world in a way that maybe Sky News Australia doesn't. I don't believe that some people just, you know, become terrorists out of a cipher. Like there's a terrorist cave that they hang out and then one day they just go out and go, let's kill some Westerners. I believe that resistance comes from the oppression of empire. It's as old as time itself, and the people who fight back are always demonized. So, yeah. But to be fair, my one ambition would be for fellows like me to build our own platforms, that we're not relying on Instagram, we're not relying on Netflix, and we're not, you know, and others like that. So I applaud you guys for what you're doing, and I genuinely have some like significant plans to follow in your footsteps and just create our own media platform completely, particularly for satirists or people doing that type of provocative comedy that's going to challenge the colonial imperial mindset.
Well, I certainly look forward to seeing what that looks like. It'll be very much needed. A couple more things here before we let you go. I wanted to ask you to respond to the idea that you're on some sort of selfie yacht vacation trip. Tell us what it's like being on the boat. I'm sure you love all the people around you, but, you know, you're stuck on a boat, probably not, you know, gourmet meals. I imagine there's not, you know, very much bathroom space. So yeah, tell me a bit about what it's like on your journey towards Gaza.
Well, I'm very happy to give people the update that I haven't showered in 3 days. You can probably smell me off the screen. We're having one meal a day. And what else could I say? Yeah, the sleeping conditions is if you happen to find a space on the ground, like you are doing well, particularly on night watch, because there's probably about maybe 8 available beds and there's 24 of us. So if we were to pick a selfie yacht kind of journey, I think we probably would pick one a little bit more comfortable and one that doesn't end in probable engagement with the most psychopathic, unpredictable army in modern times. But you know what? I don't care like if people say that kind of stuff, to be honest with you, because I know my heart, and most of the activists on this boat, a lot of them aren't on social media much anyway. They don't really care what, say, the likes of Piers Morgan or the Israelis would say about their intentions. We know why we're here, and we know that, I suppose, anybody who tries to make a difference to this horrific, horrible, just, unimaginable horror that's going on, backed to the hilt by the West, anybody who challenges that is going to be traduced. You're either on a yacht, selfie yacht, or you're Hamas, or, the propaganda is so boring at this point, So, and I also think like every accusation is a confession. In the case of Piers Morgan, for instance, a man who's made his living out of being a narcissistic media talking head, for him to accuse like Greta Thunberg or any of us to be doing this basically to get clicks, I just think is just, it's laughably transparent what's really going on there, But our consciences are clean. We know why we're here. And if somebody thinks, for instance, I'm on a jolly, like dodging drone attacks, not being able to shower, and my big bald Irish head being roasted from morning to night, then that's fine. But I'm fairly confident that I'll be able to sleep at night if I can get a space on the ground.
So, and then the last thing I want to ask you, what do you hope to accomplish with this flotilla? You're obviously participating because you think it can make a difference. And obviously you're putting a lot at risk by doing it. So what's the end goal here?
The end goal is 100% focused on opening up a humanitarian corridor. That's simply the start, the middle, and the end of it. It's a completely non-violent mission. We've spent days on end training, particularly in non-violence. It's not like a military expedition in any way, shape, or form. We are just doing the bare minimum because sadly our governments won't do even that. They won't force the hand of an occupation that is currently confiscating baby formula from Western doctors getting in and out of Gaza. Can we even get our heads around that level of depravity? So we're just doing that bare minimum because we don't accept the fact that the West seems to have just kind of washed its hands of Palestinian human life. It's basically like, yeah, okay, they're starving to death. They've been under extermination for the last couple of years in an acute way, and we're kind of just okay with it as nation states. We're not okay with it. So we're going to try and open up a humanitarian corridor. In an ideal situation, there would be, a kind of an endless humanitarian flow of goods to and fro to put the pressure on the West to just do the right thing and allow people to eat, allow people to survive. That's the bare minimum before we even talk about the illegality of the occupation and all the other war crimes that we need to look at, that I hope Israel and its backers will see justice for. But our goal is just to start a humanitarian corridor. We're certainly not heroes. A lot of us are clueless. I'm totally clueless. I've never been on a boat before in my life. The focus should be on, I think, we often get the kind of moralizing question, like, why are you doing this? Like, this is a bit crazy. Are you not being irresponsible? What's the point? I think the helicopter view question should always be, why are we in a world where we have to do this? Why on earth do civilians have to risk their life traveling to Gaza in boats? How have we got to that state? Because leaders are so weak and so craven that they won't do their job, that we have to attempt to do it for them. So that's a long and short, but I think.
Well, Tadhg, I want to thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully we get to hear some more updates from you. And I'll encourage everyone to go ahead and follow you on Instagram, on YouTube, on Twitter and all the spaces. Thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Not at all. Hopefully talk to you again sometime soon where I can hear you clearly.
Oh, Rania, for maybe not being able to hear you clearly, I thought he gave great answers. A very interesting interview and notable, and glad we were able to get someone from the flotilla once again.
Yeah, it's really incredible what people are sacrificing to be on there. I know he just had a baby. Like he said, he was a 14-week-old at home. That must have been a really tough decision to make. So people feel very strongly about getting in the way of this genocide. Speaking of which, Eugene, if you want to go ahead and introduce our next topic, we're still on Gaza.
Absolutely. Well, there obviously the ongoing genocide continues. The escalation continues inside of Gaza. I believe today at least 53 people have been killed, if I'm not mistaken. I'm trying to get the exact thing in front of me, and a number in Gaza City where there is an ongoing escalation. I'm sure many people have seen the collapsing of buildings and things like that are happening. So to get into all of this and maybe a little bit more, we are very happy to be joined once again by John Elmer, who's a contributing editor at the Electronic Intifada. John, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me back on, guys.
Well, John, I want to start with, Israel's goal here in ramping up in Gaza City, because of course the way they present it is we're preparing to ramp up to go in to take out the last stronghold of Hamas in Gaza. And I feel like we've heard that, many different times. And then I saw this little side comment maybe about a week and a half ago from some IDF official who was like, well, we expect about 10,000 fighters to escape before we even get in there. So almost sort of suggesting from the very beginning, well, we can't really defeat these people. And it just makes you wonder, what is there a military objective here? Is it just pure, collective punishment? I mean, what exactly is going on with this Gaza City op that they're engaging in and preparing?
No, I don't think there is a military objective. They're not going to achieve their military objective. They haven't done that in any of their previous operations. They already said that they had conquered Gaza City back in November and December of 2023. It's a war on civilians. And the main objective that they're trying to achieve is to have Gaza City turn into what Rafah now looks like, which is completely flattened, ethnically cleansed, destroyed. Netanyahu said it himself a number of times that the goal is to make it so that Palestinians have nowhere to go home to in Gaza. And that's what they've been doing. That's what the entire purpose of Operation Gideon's Chariots, which ran from mid-May through the end of the summer. The goal was just to destroy houses, to leave the place with nowhere to return to. And that's the goal. The fighters don't leave Gaza City. I mean, we've seen this now in every single place that Israel has gone back multiple times. They're fighting in the Zaytun neighborhood of Gaza City for the 7th time. The fighters don't move around from location to location. They're in territorial battalions, and they stay and wait until the fight comes to them in their areas of operation. When the fight was in Khan Yunis in the past couple of months, we saw the Khan Yunis Brigade carrying out that resistance. In Gaza, we're going to see the Gaza Brigade carrying out that resistance. In Jabalia, we're seeing fierce resistance from the Jabalia Brigade. So this is how Qassam has fought. They don't flee, definitely not in numbers like 10,000. The people who flee are the people who are trying to stay alive during a genocide. And we see, getting Gaza City to leave the first time back in October of 2023 was a disaster. But back then, people had cars, they had fuel, they had currency, the roads existed. To do this all over again now, 23 months, coming up on 24 months into the genocide, is an absolute catastrophe. It's just devastating. There's no currency, there's nowhere for people to go. The tent camps are all full in the south. It's a real tragedy. I mean, we're 706 days into this, and sometimes there's no words to describe it. I mean, look at what you're seeing on your screen right now, dropping entire towers and bragging about it. Netanyahu went to an air base with the Israeli Air Force and bragged about dropping 50 of these towers in 48 hours. That's what he chose to say to celebrate his Air Force at an airbase. It's just unbelievable cowardice. They don't fight the resistance. They destroy the civilian life as a punitive measure for Palestinians resisting and continuing to exist throughout this genocide.
Yeah, it's really horrifying. And, I wanted to the military objectives, they're not meeting them, and it's really just pure terror against civilians to get them to never come back, and give them nothing to come back to. But there do seem to be other tactics in place that are just cruel and horrifying, but also seem to have some logic to them. For example, with the with these humanitarian zones that are being run by GHF, which seem designed to attract the strongest member of the family, which would probably be like a teenage boy, maybe a 20-year-old boy,
Exactly.
right? Young man, who's going to be able to like trek out to one of these places so that their family doesn't starve to death and try to get a piece of food and not get shot in like Hunger Games style obstacle course. So horrifying. But this does seem designed to try to kill off the strongest people, meaning those who could be the strongest potential fighters. And maybe that's me just speculating, but that's what I see happening there. And I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on the way this GHF, aid distribution site situation has been designed and how that's playing out in Israel's broader strategy.
Yeah, it's absolutely dystopian. I mean, we would never have been able to predict this. It's devastating. The loss of sovereignty over aid is a real concern in Gaza. The United Nations and the services that were delivered through UNRWA for the refugees was dignified. It was organized. It delivered to the families that needed it. It delivered to them in more than 400 sites. They were delivered to. People got a text message that in the war, before the war, it functioned perfectly. But even in the war, they had 400 sites. They would send messages to the families, what time to come. It was dignified. It was sovereign. And this GHF is just it's unbelievable. Like you said, it harkens to some of the worst movies that you've seen. To have people come walk miles through a shoot to kill zone, and then be corralled into these pens in order to get a box of food that's not appropriate for the circumstances in Gaza. People don't have the ability to cook macaroni and cheese. They can't boil water. There's very little water. There's very little firewood. To make what's in those GHF boxes is not nutritious. It's not supplying a family. The GHF gives these numbers of how many millions of meals it's absurd. People can't survive off that. The United Nations could give them highly nutritious biscuits. There's lots of things in the aid community to deal with starvation. And the GHF is not supplying that. They're supplying Israeli products that come from the Israeli market that benefit Israel. It's a private company that is benefiting the Americans and the Israelis. And it's really undoing decades of service to the Palestinian refugee community, which and the reason why the UN Relief Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees exists. That is their link to the ethnic cleansing from their land when Israel was created. So Israel wants to destroy the United Nations mechanism. It wants to destroy dignity in Palestine and have people in circumstances where they're desperate and have nothing to do but send a family member into these mass murder cages. And more than 2,000 people have been killed in those. It's just unbelievable what we're watching.
I mean, it really is, and it's unbelievable. I mean, it's hard to even really describe in words in so many levels. And to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, John, I think that's relevant about this is just the extreme, inhumanity and dehumanization of this, because of course the whole thing is presented as a military operation, but they're not actually fighting the resistance, as you say. And I think about that because I always think, okay, if they were so great, like, why are they not releasing videos of, like, great military operations? I remember they actually released one very early on where it was, like, so embarrassing that they weren't really doing anything, and no one ever happened again. And I just think that's, like, deeply notable about the nature of the military presence in Gaza is they seem to actually be trying to avoid, any, like, super direct engagement with the resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially in this latest battle, Gideon's Chariots, they they expressly said they were not fighting the resistance. They were fighting infrastructure. They're fighting buildings. They're destroying buildings. They're destroying people's homes. They were paying people like military contractors the same way the GHF does it. Israel's doing it for excavator operators. They pay them by the size of the house, per floor, to destroy houses. I watch every single video that the Israelis put out, just like I do every single video the Palestinians put out. And you have not seen in this 2 years, you've not seen more than 24 Palestinian fighters in all of Israel's videos put together. And in Palestinian videos, you haven't seen a single civilian in these videos, more than 1,000 of them at this point. They're really telling. The Israelis don't want to fight at this point. Their army doesn't want to go into Gaza City. They're pushing back against the Netanyahu government that's creating a rift between the government and the military that is part of the reason why we have gotten these leaks of late, like the leak to Channel 12 by the IDF that said that their Gideon's chariots, that they made every single mistake possible and they failed in their mission. We're starting to see that because the soldiers don't want to fight. They don't want to die. The resistance is skilled fighters, and they exact a toll on the Israelis that the Israelis don't want from their military. And, all the while, the military wants to bring their soldiers home because they see someday they may get captured, and they have this state that doesn't care about them, doesn't want to bring them home, is willing to attack in a foreign country in Qatar in order to destroy negotiations that might bring them back home. This is not a healthy state, as everyone who's watching for the last 23 months, this is not a healthy state. It's an ethnic supremacist project. And I don't know, this can't continue like this, the way that this has been going. But they're going to get a significant battle in Gaza City because there's a significant number of fighters there. They're the most, the largest battalions, the largest brigades are in Gaza City. And I expect them to get a battle if they do anything beyond what we're seeing on the screen right now, which is just Air Force strikes against civilians. The army's not even anywhere close to these operations that are being shown on the screen right now.
I also wanted to kind of ask you if the Israelis continue, if it's not a question of is, as the Israelis continue to embark on this plan to conquer Gaza City and to try to reconquer areas they already claimed they conquered, they're talking about a 2-year-long timeline here. And I'm just curious, are we just looking at until the world says stop, an indefinite genocide scenario where they just keep going and going and going without ever achieving anything other than killing more and more people until there's, in their minds, no one left?
I mean, that's a realistic military assessment, that it will take many years because you've been fighting for 2 years and you've not been successful. The areas you fight, you leave. They just pulled out of Khan Yunis today after 4 months in Khan Yunis, saying that they're, taking over Khan Yunis. They leave Khan Yunis. So in order to stay in Gaza City and to attempt to defeat the resistance, it will take years, if it's even possible. And I think that the military at this point knows that and don't want to fight for multiple years. And that's part of the pressure that is between the government and the armed forces. And they're being run by the guy you see on the screen right now. He doesn't care about electoral politics. He's trying to stay in power because if he loses the next election, he goes to jail on corruption charges for probably the better part of a decade. And he's using the Palestinians, who they see as disposable, to carry out the wishes of this single man and his coalition to stay in power of extreme right-wing figures, even beyond the right wing in the U.S. The political spectrum in Israel is even further askew than it is in the United States.
Yeah, wow. Well, a lot to see, a lot to follow, a lot to continue to cover. And certainly not only are you watching every video, John, but you are breaking them down for us. I hope everyone is checking out the great reports that you're doing on the Electronic Intifada, as well as the live streams that you all are doing there, talking about it all and breaking it all down. And we appreciate you coming here and helping us break it all down. John Elmer, contributing editor at the Electronic Intifada. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me again.
Rania?
Eugene, before we get to the last thing that you were going to mention, I just wanted to remind people of something that we started last week. And I don't want them to think we forgot.
I was hoping that maybe you forgot, but here we are.
Oh, I didn't forget. So last week, we were at 6,348 members on Patreon. And we said if we could get 52 new members, so get to a 6,400 flat, like members, reach 6,400 members on Patreon. That would just be 52 members. By the end of the month, Eugene Puryear would start an Instagram account. That was last week. Since last week, we are now up to 6,374 members. That means, and I'm pretty sure my math is correct here, that means we got 26 new members. 26 new members in just a week. So we're halfway there. We're halfway there. We just need 26 more members, and Eugene Puryear will start an Instagram account. So if you are interested in seeing whatever Eugene decides to do with an Instagram account, which I absolutely am, I don't know. Again, I'm going to say I don't know how it's 2025 and Eugene's still not on Instagram. Please consider becoming a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news for as little as $5 a month. You will be helping to support independent media. You can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch, and you will be participating in the opening of Eugene's entrance into Instagram, which is the ultimate goal. So patreon.com/breakthrough news.
Yes. Well, listen, that's a very good progress. Better than I expected. Of course, if one person donates $2,500, you'll just jump the line and I will get on Instagram. So we'll look forward to seeing what happens in the next few weeks. And yeah, before we got out of here, Rania, I just wanted to quickly mention a Gallup poll that came out in the earlier part of the week, that the support for capitalism in the United States is at the lowest it's ever been in the past 15 years that Gallup has been polling the question. Now, it is still a majority, 54%. So, come on, people, get it together out here. Socialism is the answer. But nonetheless, you can see that's just it's a 6% drop since 2021. So a precipitous decline in support for capitalism in probably the most pro-capitalist country on the planet, where anti-communism is the official religion. And so I think it's just another notable factor how the policies of the ruling elite, whatever party they come from, are just continuing to drive discontent and disbelief that this system can deliver people just a basic, decent standard of living. And I think that will be a notable factor over the coming years as we look at the politics of the country. So just wanted to mention that before we left today.
Well, yay for socialism, and boo to capitalism. And that is my cue to go to bed.
Nice. Well, you know what? I would hate to deny you a good night's sleep, of course. It was an honor to be alongside you, as it always is. It was an honor to be with all of our fantastic guests, and of course, all of you who are out there in viewerland. Any final reminders before we get out of here, Rania?
Yeah, I just want to remind people to make sure they smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. That's my new tagline, by the way. I got to start saying that in the opening of dispatches. It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share this episode. And again, patreon.com/breakthrough news. Help support independent media at a crucial time. And also help Eugene get an Instagram account.
Excellent. Well, that will do it for us here today on Breakthrough News on the Freedom Side. Thank you so much for joining us. For myself, for Rania, for the whole BT News team, we will see you next time.